I'm Jacqueline Bars with World Wildlife Fund Canada, and I'm on the Restoration and Regeneration team, and my work focuses on the conservation and restoration of coastal marine ecosystems, including marine food webs. And I'm situated in Victoria, British Columbia, and fortunate to live and learn in the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. I'm going to discuss Forage Fish Monitoring Network in the Salish Sea, identifying forage fish habitat for conservation. So forage fish are small to intermediate sized marine fishes, which include herring, capelin, sandlance, and different smelt species. They support a huge range of predators as prey. Many species, including groundfish, salmonids, seabirds, seals, whales, rely on forage fish to convert the energy contained in plankton into higher value bite-sized food. They are the key bridge within the marine food web. And for that reason, they are essential to both the continued health of the marine ecosystem and to coastal communities. In British Columbia, these are the commonly recognized species of forage fish. Some forage fish contain data gaps, for example, around abundance and distribution, especially if the fish species are not of commercial focus, like the Pacific sandlance and surf smelt. Pacific herring, being a commercially fished species, tend to have more focus on their habitats, biomass, and abundance to help support the fishery. However, these non-commercial species tend to be very important to the health and condition of other ecologically and culturally important species, including the Chinook salmon. And due to this ecological role of supporting healthy marine food webs, it is crucial to understand the use of their habitat. And therefore, it's vital to understand the changes to their use and of their habitat over time in relation to the distribution and abundance, as well as within context of climate change. For example, certain habitats or habitat locations might be used more when there's a lower amount of these fish species around. And additionally, surf smelt are also culturally important food species for the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish people tend to collect surf smelt in bays and estuaries during their spawning events, and they tend to store them for winter consumption. Thus, changes to or loss of habitat around the Salish Sea could impact the availability of this fish species as a food source to the Coast Salish people. Now, there is general knowledge of certain habitat requirements for Pacific sandlance and surf smelt. These are both species found within the nearshore shallow environments from Alaska to Northern California, and they are a coastal fish species. Pacific sandlance feed in pelagic waters, and they tend to rest and overwinter by burrowing themselves in medium to coarse sand in the subtidal bottoms of the ocean. They lack a swim bladder, so that's why they bury into this rich oxygenated sediment, and it tends to offer them protection from predators. However, Pacific sandlance around Washington State and southern British Columbia will depart their burrowing habitat in the wintertime to go up onto the beaches that contain medium to coarse sand, as well as gravel beaches to lay their eggs. And surf smelts are dedicated beach spawners. They glue their eggs onto coarse sand and gravel material in the upper intertidal section, and they forage in that pelagic water, nearshore pelagic waters as well. And spawning events tend to occur in this really distinct upper 1/3, close to the terrestrial environment. So the image on this slide really kind of highlights the type of spawning material preference for Pacific sandlance and surf smelt in that upper 1/3 of the intertidal region. Pacific sandlance tend to spawn on sand to pea gravel, while surf smelt will tend to go from coarse sand to kind of a fine pebble mix. And sand and gravel beach spawning habitat for Pacific sandlance and surf smelt occur due to natural coastal processes. So the erosion of material from the backshore, and then the settlement and transportation of this material through water. And these processes are very important, and they need to be maintained to continually replenish the beaches to provide adequate spawning habitat material. And it's also important to maintain the backshore to have natural vegetation that helps to provide bank stability and shelter and shade to prevent desiccation to some of the eggs. But because they are spawning in this upper intertidal region, the eggs are now exposed to more terrestrial threats, such as pollution from stormwater drains, the impacts from development, desiccation as a result of that riparian vegetation removal. But a major threat that is being experienced by these forage fish is coastal squeeze to their spawning habitat. So that is hard armoring, seawalls and armor storm, that is put up to protect infrastructure from rising seas and prevent material from eroding into the ocean. Well, this actually prevents the natural coastal processes that are supposed to occur, and that is that landward migration of the beach and the erosion of that backshore material to create sand and gravel beaches. So in natural conditions with rising sea levels, we would tend to have these beaches just naturally migrate towards land. And the beach width tends to remain the same, and therefore spawning habitat is available for these fish. However, on armored shoreline, as the sea level rises, it results in these two tidal lines coming closer together and basically narrowing the beach width and cutting off that upper habitat that the forage fish want to use. And so this may result in that habitat narrowing or disappearing altogether. And this could have a localized or regional effect to the coastal and marine ecosystem. And these impacts might actually be observed in those species that are reliant on them, such as the Chinook salmon. So why is this important to understand? Well, as I previously mentioned, there are data gaps that exist for these ecologically important forage fish species. There are significant numbers of impacts that are occurring to their spawning habitat, which could result in the loss of this habitat. And we don't know how much habitat is needed to sustain these fish species, but we are aware that it's being lost. So to effectively protect and conserve key habitat, it is important to know where this beach spawning habitat is in British Columbia and when it's being used by Pacific sandlance and surf smelt. Thus, it's important to monitor sand and gravel beaches to determine habitat location and the timing of spawning events. So to monitor the sand and gravel beaches in the BC Salish Sea to determine if they're being used for spawning, it requires a network of organizations to coordinate and support community-based scientists to survey beaches. And thus a monitoring network consisting of community-based scientists really does help to expand the geographic extent of an area being sampled and resulting in kind of this simultaneous coverage of our coastline. And it provides a more holistic view of where beach spawning habitat in the BC Salish Sea can be existing. So we are working with localized community groups and volunteers to help assist in the data collection within these various regions of the BC Salish Sea. So around the east coast of Vancouver Island, the Sunshine Coast, there's these different organizations helping to support the volunteers that are going out. And the volunteers that are going out are collecting bulk sediment samples. They're processing the sample down to a smaller side. And then they provide these samples where, of course, there's, hopefully eggs glued on to the sediment to be analyzed and determine if this is the location where the spawning is occurring. And the Pacific Salmon Foundation is supporting different organizations' ability to be able to provide field equipment to conduct these beach surveys. And so when the examples are brought in, dissecting scopes are used to analyze the sand samples for forage fish eggs. So the sample material is added to a petri dish that tends to contain a pattern that makes it easier for the lab technician to move the sample around to look for these small little forage eggs that are attached to the sediments. And then these positive detections that occur kind of identify which beaches are being used for spawning events. And the validation of the eggs for the species type indicates whether the habitat is belonging to surf smelt, Pacific sandlance, or both species. So this slide highlights the sites being monitored in the Salish Sea by the Forage Fish Monitoring Network. There are now about 184 sites being monitored, with 45 sites being positive for Pacific sandlance and 11 sites positive for surf smelt up to December of 2020. And this would not be possible without community-based science and their access to field equipment provided by the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So these are some of the amazing community groups that are out collecting samples in the different regions of the Salish Sea. And these are some of the great scientific and collaborative partnerships and funders within the Forage Fish Monitoring Network. And the Forage Fish Monitoring Network's data is being submitted to the Strait of Georgia Data Center, which is a secure data archive built by the Pacific Salmon Foundation and the University of British Columbia. It is an open access database, and data sharing agreements are established between the Pacific Salmon Foundation and the different organizations collecting the data. So all the data is now available publicly on this website. In the data overview for the forage fish, all the data is kind of organized into regional folders to kind of give you an idea of where habitat's occurring, and they're kind of compiled into a larger dominant record. And if you click on the link, this is what you would tend to see. And the Pacific Salmon Foundation also works with us collaborators to develop different engagement tools for the public. And so this story map, developed collaboratively, really helps to highlight the crucial role of forage fish within the marine food web and the threats that are facing them. And further engagement through the Pacific Salmon Foundation Salmon Steward magazine also helps to elevate the work of various monitoring organizations, such as the Mount Arrowsmith Biosphere Region Research Institute. And public engagement is critical in the conservation of important habitat, and data collected by this network resulted in publication within the scientific community. And so, of course, Will is going to be able to speak more about kind of using public and community science to identify habitat stuff.